Today we're going to examine the sequence of events that led to a fatal mishap of an SR22 on Saturday, September 28th at the First Flight Airport in Kill Devil Hills, North Carolina. The accident occurred at 5:18 p.m. It was a 2023 Cirrus SR22 with 5 souls on board, 4 adults and 1 6-year-old child. The aircraft crashed on its second landing attempt at First Flight Airport. We know that on board the aircraft were a pilot who was a commercial certificated instrument-rated pilot, and there was also a student pilot aboard. We do not know if the student pilot was manipulating the controls in any way. We know from the METAR that the weather that day was fairly nice. It was 170-degree winds at 6 knots, gusts to 14, 10 miles visibility, and about 80 degrees. So by all accounts, a beautiful day, although a little bit gusty. The flight originated from the Dare County Regional Airport, and it was about an 8-minute flight up to First Flight Airport. The pilot entered a left downwind and made 2 landing attempts. On the first approach into First Flight, the pilot entered the left downwind at about 154 knots at about 1,100 feet. Pattern altitude is about 1,000 at this airport. The airport elevation is basically sea level, 12 feet above sea level. So the pilot entered the left downwind a little bit fast at pattern altitude and had gotten the airspeed down to 90 knots before the turn to final, again at 1,000 feet pattern altitude. Notice the pilot is at 1,000 feet on the base leg here about to turn final. The first attempt of landing ended up with the pilot initiating a go-around. We don't know why, and that go-around was successful. On the second attempt, the pilot again flew the aircraft to a base to final turn position of about 90 knots, and again at about pattern altitude, in this case about 900 feet. The pilot made a landing attempt. We don't know exactly what happened during the landing attempt, but we know that control was lost and the aircraft impacted the trees. By our analysis, it impacted the trees at about this position to the left of the runway in the tree line. From local news sources, we know that they allege that one of the pieces of the airplane was observed in the tree line about halfway up the tree. And we also know from the open source news reporting that the wreckage was here just next to this big tree trunk, and it appears that most of the wreckage is there. The NTSB will do a much more detailed investigation of the wreckage layout and the path of arrival. We could not determine that from the pictures that were available. So what factors will the NTSB look at to examine the causes of this tragic mishap? One thing that they'll look at is the geography of the airport. The First Flight Airport sits on the coastline in North Carolina, where the downwind and base and part of the final would be over the water. Not a big deal, but that's a factor. They would also look at the visual distractions or visual features prominent at the airport, which is the Wright Brothers Monument itself, just to the east of the runway, to an elevation of about 151 feet. Runway 21 and runway 3 are carved out of the trees at First Flight Airport, and the chart supplement reminds pilots that there are trees on both sides of those runways. They remind pilots that there's a 300-foot transmission line and a 300-foot tower and water tank about a half a mile north of runway 21. These obstacles don't appear to protrude into the flight path, but they are great information for pilots to refresh themselves to be aware of the geography flying in. Notice that the chart supplement does talk about right traffic, and so does the sectional. Right traffic for 2-1, and the pilot did come in on a left downwind and flew left traffic. Another factor the NTSB may look at are the winds that day. They were 170 at 6 gusts 14, about 40 degrees left of runway heading, and that may have been a factor because of mechanical turbulence. As the wind's blowing across the trees, it will cause gusty conditions and not a steady wind flow. And there were local banner towing pilots that posted on the Pilots of America forum how it's very common at this airport to experience stable, smooth winds in downwind and final, and then experience some mechanical turbulence caused by the trees. That may have been a factor in this mishap. Another factor the NTSB may look at is the overall gross weight of the aircraft and the CG of the aircraft. The SR22 has a max gross takeoff weight of 3,600 pounds. And depending on how it's equipped, it has a max useful load of about 1,300 pounds. We know there were 4 adults plus 1 6-year-old child aboard. And we know the aircraft just came from Dare County, where it may have fueled up with full fuel. If that's true, then the aircraft certainly was operating near max gross weight, and Cirrus instructors we spoke with said that that may have put put the CG near the aft limit. None of the instructors we talked to said it would put it out of limits for weight or for CG. We also know from searching the characteristics of the aircraft that the Cirrus SR22 at max gross takeoff weight will take 2,500 feet to land over a 50-foot obstacle and only 1,800 feet to take off over a 50-foot obstacle. None of these factors by themselves stand out, but it's a 3,000-foot runway that's 60 feet wide. Another factor the NTSB may look at is the steepness of both of the approaches. On the first approach, the pilot was observed turning from base to final at about 1,000 feet, which is pattern altitude. On the second approach, we did a deeper analysis of the ADSB exchange data indicated by these yellow boxes, and the turn from base to final was from 1,000 or 850 feet as he rolls wings level on final, and each one of the boxes indicated here on the chart show the about 80 knot airspeed, which is stabilized and per the Cirrus Flight Ops Manual, but it shows a very steep descent angle of about 6 to 7 degrees. And more importantly, ADSB exchange history data shows that the last two data points had a descent rate of 960 and then 1,024 feet a minute. Again, in and of itself, probably not a single causal factor for the mishap, but it is a steep descent rate, complicating what would be a round out and flare for an airplane at near max gross weight in gusty conditions. So what caused this mishap? We know that a loss of control during landing happened. The SR22 at max gross weight will be looked at, the gusty winds at first flight, and the pilot's proficiency. Was the pilot trained in stabilized approaches? Had he demonstrated stabilized approaches to recent instruction? Did he fly standardized pattern procedures? Is there a history of that? And is the pilot competent and proficient in executing a go-around? And in this case, a go-around in a high gross weight airplane and in gusty conditions. It's important to note that the NTSB data, which we study extensively, shows that in 2021, the last year we have full data for, that the loss of control is the leading cause of all general aviation accidents, fatal and non-fatal. This is the non-commercial fixed-wing data, and it shows for 2021 that there were 43 takeoff and landing accidents caused by loss of control, 3 of which were fatal. And in the landings phase, there were 147 mishaps, 4 of which were fatal. So loss of control is the single leading cause of general aviation accidents and therefore worthy of our attention for proficiency in flight training and flight reviews and just daily practice. Stabilized approaches, we hear about it all the time in general aviation. We looked up the Cirrus Flight Operations Manual and it talks about a stabilized approach in this way. Certainly Cirrus pilots would have been trained in this by the Cirrus instructors. But a stabilized approach occurs when you have a proper airspeed, the correct flight path, correct configuration, appropriate power setting, normal rate of descent and angle of descent, and where only minor corrections are required to fix any deviations. In this case, both the pilot's trips down final approach were at a steeper approach angle. Again, not a single causal factor, but certainly could have been a contributor. Another thing that's talked about extensively in the Flight Ops Manual for Cirrus is the go-around procedures and proficiency. Cirrus expects you to execute a go-around anytime the approach does not meet stabilized approach criteria or when you have ballooning, porpoising, bouncing, are going to land beyond the first third of the runway, or anytime a safe landing is in question. Most of the Cirrus instructors we spoke to also stressed the importance of a properly executed go-around, which includes reducing the AOA, feeding in full power commensurate with right rudder, and then flying the aircraft away from the ground while slowly bringing the flaps up to 50%. If those things aren't done properly and in the right order, the aircraft is very hard to control when the energy state is lower, as it might have been during a second landing attempt at first flight. The NTSB will take up to the next 2 years to analyze and then publish their final probable causes for this tragic mishap. Pilots are encouraged to practice stabilized approaches and exercise proficiency in proper go-around procedures. Thank you.